Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. Now, this episode is part of the series on my channel called Type 1 Diabetics Talk, where both host and guest are type 1s, and we discuss, you guessed it, type 1 diabetes and related topics. Now, I'll put the playlist link below in the description notes. Please check out the other episodes and let me know what you think of them. So today's guest has PhD in engineering, and with his engineer's mind and the ability to read numbers, to interpret data and analyze causes and outcomes, he dedicates a lot of his time to diabetes education and researching particularly type 1 diabetes. Jon Furniss from the UK, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
Jon, what did I leave out when I introduced you to the audience? Why don't you fill in the gaps? So from engineer to type 1 diabetes research.
Yeah, so I think you put your finger on it there, really. You know, the essence of my approach to life and problem solving is root cause analysis, understanding the underlying causes of an issue. And you see it time and time again. You know, there's a number of people in this metabolic health space who are doing great work, who themselves have an engineering background. And I'm thinking of people like Dave Feldman and Ivor Cummins, and there are, you know,
Marty Kendall, I've interviewed.
Yeah, and Richard Bernstein, you know, he wrote the Bible on this, and it was only after he'd been turned away from numerous diabetic conferences with his luggage-sized glucometer that he'd built in his backyard, that he decided to turn his back on engineering and go into medicine in order that he could get the credibility to, you know, give the information around blood glucose measurements and then taking control, which led him to his approach, which he's so generously shared with us via his wonderful book. Unfortunately for me, I hadn't found his book by myself, and I'd been living with type 1 diabetes for 7 years. So I was diagnosed age 39, lived with it for 7 years, taking standard advice on what to eat and how to manage my diabetes badly. But unfortunately, my bad control, as I see it now, was deemed as good control back then, and I was given a slap on the back regularly. You know, your HbA1c is pre-diabetic level in terms of, you know, type 2 diabetes. So I'd you know, I exceeded the type 2 pre-diabetes threshold of 42 millimoles per mole. But that was okay. I was still getting slapped on the back. And it was only when I bumped into a friend of mine who he had been living with cluster headaches, extreme migraines that come on like clockwork and can make people almost, you know, or actually suicidal, because they're so bad and they're so enigmatic. People can't understand why it's happening. But, you know, one explanation of what's going on is glucose hypometabolism in the brain cells. They can't burn the glucose, and, you know, things go awry in the brain, and a migraine comes on as a result. Anyway, that friend of mine, he had gone to a ketogenic lifestyle, and so he was living with a dietary intake of maybe 30 grams of carbs or something, and he didn't suffer a single migraine after that. And I met him like 1 year in, and he was like, this is just, I've been living with this for 22 years, and all of a sudden, no headaches, ever. And the neurosurgeon who he was seeing thought this was really interesting. You know, you haven't had an attack. Well, what's going on? What have you done? I changed my diet. Oh, okay. Not interested. So really disappointing for him, and he tried to get some traction, and I think he has got a tiny amount of traction, but really you know, his method hasn't involved any, you know, drugs that can be purchased. And so therefore the medical establishment wasn't interested in him. Just as, you know, when we have our diabetes consultations and we talk to an endocrinologist who should be specialist in this area and specialist in controlling blood sugars to normal levels if possible. But again, they show no interest in how we've done this. So it's a shame, but he exposed me to the idea that, you know, the medical establishment has been captured by the pharmaceutical industry, and we've got to figure this out for ourselves. And so with my root cause, you know, analytical mindset, I started to scratch into, you know, why is he saying this, and why is he now teaching me about insulin when I've been injecting this stuff for 7 years? And is what he's saying, you know, does it make any sense? So I connected with the Public Health Collaboration and Dr. Ian Lake, who I believe you've spoken to yourself on this series recently. I looked at some of his YouTube videos, and I started to key into scientists, researchers, and medics who appeared to me to be following an evidence-based approach, where, you know, emotion and bias and baggage and all of those things were removed, and all that was relied upon was good quality evidence. So I started listening to people like Zoe Harcum, who you may have come across, and you know, I
interviewed her.
Yeah, she's wonderful, isn't she? And, you know, just reading her dissections of things that are reported on in the press, you know, ad nauseum, because there's so many articles on epidemiological studies that just aren't worth the paper they're printed on. She's, and people like her who I've listened to, have really exposed me to, you know, decoding the common wisdom, received wisdom, out there, which helps to trap us in a poor state of health, as I was being trapped until I bumped into that guy who I hadn't seen for 22 years, who'd gone keto, and I followed him into doing that almost overnight after I checked in with, you know, those Ian Lake resources. You know, a GP living with type 1 diabetes, he obviously gets it. And then looking at his work and who he was affiliated with, Public Health Collaboration, I immediately became comfortable that that was a good source of information that was worth listening to. And there were others. There's a US medic, I can't remember his name at the moment. I think he's a nephrologist. Keith.
Runyon, Dr. Runyon?
Yes, yeah. So I listened to his content as well. And a couple of others, which gave me the confidence to cut my carbs dramatically from maybe 400 grams a day. You know, I was exercising athlete, consuming large amounts of sugary stuff as well as the starchy stuff. Cut it to maybe 40 grams almost overnight. So that required, you know, a massive reduction in my insulin requirements, which I did, and I managed myself. I didn't get any help from my healthcare team doing this. And yeah, there's no point trying to do that without being well informed, because I guess you could come unstuck. But I felt very well informed about what I was doing, and it's been a great success.
Well, my story is very similar to yours, Jon, in that I had to figure it out myself because I received absolutely no support from my healthcare team. In fact, I was dismissed. I probably started it before you, 2015. So when I kind of mentioned it, that I've lowered my carbs, I was told, well, I was still young, and if I needed a baby, I must be eating carbohydrates. And of course, that's completely not true. In fact, the opposite turns out to be true now. But, you know, infertility clinics are opening worldwide now, treating people through lifestyle medicine, lowering their carbohydrates, lowering the insulin level, and boom, you know, someone falls pregnant. But so you touched briefly on your diagnosis story. So you were diagnosed. How did you know it was type 1 What were your symptoms? Because you were an adult then, you were 39, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'd been suffering quite badly, and I'd been putting all those symptoms down to other things that were going on in life. Young children, so hence that's why I was so fatigued and tired, because I was running around after them, as well as doing hard sport and not resting enough in between the bouts of sport. So again, I'm thinking, that's why I'm feeling so fatigued, surely. I'd been trying to drink more water. I'd heard people say, target X liters per day of water consumption, and that'll be good for you. So I'd been trying to drink more water. And I thought that that's why I was waking up in the night to go to the toilet and not really noticing that I was leaving a cup of water on my bedside table and usually consuming one or two of those during the night. So I guess I had a range of reasons for why I was feeling as lousy as I was, but I remember, there was a few days where I was at work having a big heavy lunch, and after that, just falling asleep at my desk. And I guess I just failed to look around and notice, nobody else is doing this. Nobody else is falling asleep at their desk. Surely there's something seriously wrong here. And I remember going out and having a little sleep on a grassy bank halfway through the afternoon, just to try and deal with the fatigue, which was, it was just runaway blood glucose, probably at levels of, postprandial, I imagine high teens, millimoles per liter. And what revealed the actual problem was a work medical examination, because I was due to mobilize to Australia for a work assignment. And that picked up a fasting glucose of I think it was about 11 millimoles per liter. So they then gave me an HbA1c test, very high, and I was appearing as a diabetic, but they said, we don't really know what to do with you. You're lean, you're fit, you're not presenting as a type 2, and you seem to be too old for type 1. So they put me in this clinically interesting category, which I didn't feel very comfortable with. And so I was starting to think, pancreatic cancer, or what could this be? But yeah, I saw a specialist in the hospital, and I think this is where it sort of started to go wrong in terms of getting good care. That in order to fast track this, I saw a specialist in the private sector. And I didn't get good care from that person. I never even got antibody test results. They did some tests and they never even reported them to me. And then I was shipped off to Australia, with a fresh type 1 diagnosis, learning how to titrate insulin on the flight to Australia, which was challenging, and yeah, completely by myself. But then having arrived over there, I wasn't in the NHS system. I wasn't in their Medicare system. I was just expensing my insulin on private medical insurance and not getting any real care for how to do better as a type 1 diabetic. So I was just drifting upwards in my HbA1c tests, but like I said at the beginning, still getting slapped on the back because I was doing better than most other people who were still continuing to have very poor lifestyles. My lifestyle was good, but and I did remove half of the carbs, I think, just naturally. It seemed like the right thing to do to reduce my carb consumption. But I enjoyed sweet stuff so much that I retained all of those, all the cakes. I just cut all the starchy carbs. So I cut the potatoes and the pasta and the rice and stuff, but kept at that point in time the sweet stuff, which I now know was a really miserable mistake. But you live and learn.
For the audience, Jon is obviously using the measurements, millimoles over a liter that we use in the UK and some other parts of the world. So I will put in the description below the conversion chart, which actually I have in front of me, and it's free to download from my website. So I'll put the link below so you can download that and carry it around with you, or you can have it on your phone. I actually have a copy on my phone. I'm constantly referring to that. Okay, so Jon, what types of insulin do you use now? And also diabetes technology. Let's talk about diabetes technology. The only ones I'm using is my Omnipod pump, which is on my leg at the moment, and my Freestyle Libre. And for anyone wondering, no, they don't talk to each other, so they don't really correspond with each other. So which ones are you using?
So I've avoided the use of a pump. I have a personal worry about the use of pumps across the population, perhaps not a problem at all for people like yourself. But the trouble I foresee with this technology, especially when it's combined with closed loop and artificial pancreas style systems, is that it's going to be further encouragement to follow the diktat of, diabetes dietitians across the country in where we live in the UK, which is eat what you want and cover it with insulin. If you've got an artificial pancreas that's well programmed and well functioning, that is going to really encourage you to continue down that line of eating what you want and covering it with more and more insulin. And I think that's really terrible. So I have this bias against that technology for that reason. I think that if I was using it, I wouldn't be using it to facilitate, to enable me to, eat chocolate brownies and stuff. But I think what I would end up doing is disappearing a little bit into programming that system and perfecting it. And I would I'd invest even more of the time that I don't have into fine-tuning my diabetes control using that technology. So I haven't ever done that. I use the Freestyle Libre, and I've got one of those on my arm right now. And I just use a basal insulin. I'm using Tresiba. I used to use Lantus. I was alerted to Tresiba and how it might help me control my diabetes better. But I don't actually see that much difference between the action of Lantus and Tresiba for me. I've been splitting my basal dose 50-50 for a long time now. So I'll have 50% of it about 8 a.m., the other 50% about 8 p.m. And I find that does help even out my blood glucose, especially overnight. When I used to put it all in at night, I used to get lows overnight, but that doesn't happen anymore now. I'm splitting my basal. And then for bolus insulin, I use Nova Rapid. After having changed my diet, I was finding that Nova Rapid was a bit too fast. So having removed all the carbohydrates. But then I think as, my metabolism and the way my body works has shifted after having been very low carb for a long time. That Nova Rapid is now the right, it's now the right speed of action. So after going keto, I did switch to Humulin for a while, but then I found that Humulin was just too slow, and so I switched back to Nova Rapid, and that's working very well for me. So my dosages, I'll have 8 units twice a day of basal with Tresiba, and then about 5 units with each meal. And I eat twice a day, once at lunch and at dinner time. So usually a 16-8 kind of fasting regime, intermittent fasting regime. And then longer fasts, a 24-hour fast maybe once a month. And then an extended fast maybe once a quarter, going into 2, 3, and I've fasted up to 5 days.
Okay, let's come back to your, so the bolus insulin is Nova Rapid, obviously, which is what I'm doing. So roughly 5 units per meal. So yes. Do you take the 5 units in one go, or do you split it? What do you do? Or do you take it before the meal, after the meal? What's your strategy there?
My ideal strategy is to inject about 30 minutes prior to the meal, but I normally forget, and I normally mess this up and then end up having an injection a few minutes before the meal, which is a little bit too late. And so I do see a bit of a rise as an unfortunate consequence of living too busy lifestyle. And I know that, you know, if I was to go into a closed loop system and program that, and, you know, I could, you know, probably correct that and negate it. But yeah, like I've already said, I'm not up for that challenge, certainly not today. So ideally about half an hour before, I would inject my roughly 5 units. And I've got to the stage now where I glance at my plate and estimate, you know, that's not 5 units, that's maybe 7 units worth. It's a bigger meal or whatever. But I was tracking food. I was weighing absolutely everything for about a year. But I think that got me to the stage of being able to glance at my plate and know instinctively how much insulin that meal was going to cost me, which is the way I look at this now. How much insulin does your lifestyle cost you?
I've got pretty good at it too. I just eyeball my meals. But you know, I'm managing my meals also with Nova Rapid. And for a very long time, I've been dreaming of accessing, which isn't very easy in the UK. It's not commonly prescribed, or accessing, our insulin that Dr. Bernstein recommends to cover protein. And in fact, when I mentioned it, I was to my consultant. He wasn't very happy. He said, "You're doing a fine job with with what you have. Why change? You know what's working." And he does have a point, but little does he realize how hard it is to manage to cover protein and the slow rise of protein with fast-acting, rapid-acting insulin. So unlike you, I can't take it. I don't take it because I would crash if I just took the whole dose of, I don't know, 3 units, 2.5 or whatever it may be in one go. I would crash almost definitely because I've tried it over and over again. So I take it sort of intermittently post-meal. The first largest dose, probably about 30% of what I'm planning to take, I take in advance while I'm eating, while I start eating, and then the rest, I keep scanning myself, you know, every 20 minutes, and then see how it goes, and then take small doses. That's when I fall in love over and over again with my pump, because it gives me the possibility of taking tiny little doses and, you know, almost 5 doses, 5 boluses to cover my one meal, 5 boluses of 0.3 units of insulin. If I were on MDI, I wouldn't want to be doing that. So this is why I love my pump. That's one reason I love my pump. But you know, anyone who puts their mind to it, anyone who wants to manage their diabetes well, they can do it actually with the tools available to them, even with a glucometer like Dr. Bernstein used to do for decades and decades before the CGMs came about. So this isn't about technology. Technology is not going to solve all our issues. You know, it takes hard work. Don't you agree? It takes hard work.
Absolutely. It is such a shame, you know, you drop into a diabetes conference, for instance, which I've done a couple of times. The bit that takes, you know, what takes effort and time and energy is the lifestyle change. And then, you know, you can make optimizations, as you've been saying, with, you know, timing of dosages and stuff like that. And that takes time as well. But I think the biggest sort of drain on us as we make these changes is making the lifestyle changes. I think just choosing to use a different insulin, for instance, or if you were type 2 diabetic, a different tablet to control your insulin sensitivity. You know, that choice is very easy to win that one. And therefore, I think it's very easy to see the delight on, diabetologists, endocrinologists, public health leaders' faces when they're faced with a new drug which promises to make things easier for the patient and easier for the clinician. And then, so you watch 5 of those presentations, and then a lifestyle presentation comes up, and they're twiddling their fingers, they're drumming their hands on the table, they're looking at their watch, they're yawning, and they're maybe popping out to the toilet or something. And it's just really sad to see that anything that requires effort to address, the root causes of your poor management, or if in type 2 diabetes, the root causes of your diabetes in the first place. It's so sad that clinicians up and down the country and healthcare professionals and the public health industry, it isn't excited about those lifestyle changes that can affect the root cause. Work I do with public health collaboration, we do work with a few type 1s, but mainly type 2 diabetics. It's just so wonderful and so rewarding. And, you listen to people like David Unwin, who, are very clear about their experience of finding this lifestyle medicine as an alternative approach to delivering healthcare, and how it's re-energized his passion for medicine, and his, get up and go has been reignited. He's running into the office, as it were, can't wait to get on with the next day's work. Whereas what he says is, I used to come in feeling quite dejected that nobody I was treating was being helped. And what, learning from David Unwin and others, PHC is now delivering this. We're starting to ramp up to some scale to deliver it to type 2 diabetics.
Tell us more about your involvement with the PHC, is the public health collaboration. Well, first of all, for anyone who hasn't heard of them, what do they do? The public health collaboration it's a UK charity, by the way, and Jon is an ambassador. So tell us more about them. Yeah,
its raison d'etre is to address the growing public health emergency in poor metabolic health, and to reverse that. And ultimately, the vision, the goal is to help save the NHS from an inevitable, as I would see it, implosion under the weight of this metabolic burden and the chronic diseases that are driven by poor metabolic health. So that's the reason it exists. It's led by a group of clinicians, research scientists, dietitians who have seen the light from a nutritional perspective, that they, as I now do, look at diet with respect to the nutrients that it provides. How do I feed myself the nutrients that I need? So which are the most nutritious foods for the highest nutrient density? So the lowest amount of calories for the highest amount of nutrition. Those essential amino acids, those essential fatty acids, those vitamins, those minerals. How do I get those in my body for the least amount of calories? And then as a type 1, wants to, manage my blood glucose to normal levels, that naturally drives me towards a lower carbohydrate diet anyway, focusing on nutrient density. But I'm super aware of any carbs in my diet, so I just discard all of those empty carbs that don't have any nutrients associated with them. So PHC that's its mission, I've just mentioned, and what I helped to set up within the PHC. So we already had in PHC ambassadors like myself going into surgeries and offering an information service to deliver a program to type 2 diabetics and pre-diabetics, to give them information to help them to control their type 2 diabetes and hopefully put it into reverse or even clinical remission. So that's a voluntary program, but when I was doing that as well as dozens of others up and down the country. But then I helped to set up a paid-for service that surgeries could pay PHC to refer their patients who had maybe recently been given a pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes diagnosis. And it's a structured education program, and it was designed by Expert Health. You may know Trudy Deakin.
Trudy Deakin is also someone I've interviewed, so I'll put all the links below.
Excellent. Yeah, so she designed our program, and it's called The Lifestyle Club. And we have referrals come to us, and we deliver a Zoom-based 8-week program, and then we continue to work with them for as long as they want to be in touch with us on a monthly catch-up call after the 8-week program finishes. And we get great results similar to what David Unwin is seeing, and he's seeing 50% clinical remission rate.
That's excellent. And talking of the PHC, let's remind the audience that the PHC have annual conferences. So this year, the conference is coming up in Sheffield in about, I think, 10 days' time. Are you going to be there, Jon?
I'm on holiday, unfortunately. I guess every cloud has a silver lining, and in this case, I'm gutted not to be able to make the annual conference this year, but I will be cycling in a hot country with friends, having fun. So yeah,
that's equally enjoyable. That's equally enjoyable. Okay, you're going to be cycling, so let's talk about exercise. So how do you manage your blood sugars? Do you usually cycle?
Yeah, so I've been a competitive cyclist, so a good club level competitor for many years. I guess I got into sport about age 10 and did a lot of different sports, running and athletics and cross country and track and field, and then racket sports, basketball, did a lot of that, and then got into cycling. And cycling is the thing that I've continued, and so I've raced in various different competitions, road racing, criteriums, track cycling, a little bit of sort of cyclocross. And then I got into time trialing, and that I sort of kept that up until quite recently. I haven't ridden a time trial race for a little while. And time trial is anything between about 10 miles and 24 hours. So that'd be 24 hours non-stop. And so, yeah, I've done a range of different, shorter races, about an hour, 2 hours duration, but all the way up to, a 24-hour event. And yeah, I'd always fueled all of that activity with, bananas, gels, bars, all the usual stuff, sports drink. I'd usually suffered, in some cases, quite severe gastrointestinal distress to ingest all that garbage whilst moving, whilst working hard, and just that dietary input on its own is going to make your tummy feel bad. And now, I look back on it and shudder, at what I was doing to my body. The insulin spikes, the cost of that lifestyle, the insulin cost of that lifestyle would have been very high. Ingesting quite a few extra 1,000 calories in those processed carbs it would just be so damaging. And I believe that it probably helped to damage my gut, and it probably helped to give me my type 1 diabetes. We know we can't blame it on one thing, it's multifactorial. But I truly believe in the primacy of the gut and gut function in modulating, our march towards autoimmune conditions, of which we know 1 diabetes is one of them. So I believe, if I'd have preserved my gut function better and not done that, I may have been less likely to develop my type 1 late in life. I know I can't prove that, and I've got no evidence that I can call on to point, to draw a line from one thing to the other. And I do know that there are many other genetics is obviously sets the stage, and then there's stuff that we do which helps to light the fire, isn't it? And I think that's one of the things I did to light the fire of my what I think is probably chronic inflammation, poor gut permeability, and then my type 1 diabetes diagnosis came later. So yeah, that's how I fueled my sport then, and how I do it now.
How do you do it now, and how do you adjust your insulin? How do you make sure your blood sugars stay in check?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did recently, and this is fantastic, and I don't know if it will show on screen because I've got screen blurring, but you can maybe see there. I've managed to get my Freestyle Libre talking to my Garmin watch. And I did that. I bumped into another type 1 who mentioned he was doing this. I've been looking to do this for forever. So if you're cycling a bike at 25, 30 miles an hour in a pack of other cyclists where you're very close together, and you don't want to risk reaching into your back pocket, getting your phone, swiping whilst traveling at that speed, maybe just about to go into a blind corner with a car coming the opposite direction. Not a good idea. But being able to glance at one's watch and know that, I'm at 4.5 trending upwards, great. I'll have another look in 20 minutes. And if I happen to be 7.9 trending upwards, then I might want to do something about that. And then I might mention to the others, that we might sort of pull over at the next junction, and I could do something about it, maybe put a correction dose of insulin in. So that's been a game changer for me as a competitive athlete. I use the X-Drip Plus app, and there's another app that I've installed in order to sit between X-Drip Plus and the Garmin watch, and that's an app called OOP Algorithm 2. I can send you a link to that, and you could put it, because if, like me, there may be other people out there using Freestyle Libre 2, but a bit annoyed that they can't get it to communicate with their watch or some other product, they might want to do something similar. It's been a real game changer to me, because I now can glance at my watch and I know exactly where my blood sugar is. So that helps. But typically my regime would be, check my blood glucose before, consider a corrective dose. But then there's some real guesswork that creeps in for me, that I can go out and do a ride. It might be a 2-hour ride. I might sort of go easy the first 20 minutes and then start putting some hard efforts in. And it might be an endurance ride going on for 2 hours. And I might put no insulin in prior and run a very steady blood glucose, maybe rising up to 6.5 or something during the ride, and then dropping back to something normal, 4.6 or something afterwards. Fantastic. Same ride, different day, same condition, same time of day, spike up to 15. And I can't predict exactly when that's going to happen. I just can try to react to it, in which case, if I see that upswing, I can maybe put some in fast-acting insulin in, maybe control the effort that I'm putting in on the bike, to try and even out that spike. So I don't eat anything prior to. I don't eat anything during, unless it's a cafe stop with friends who want to have a coffee, and there may be an interesting bacon, eggs, and something breakfast that I might be interested in. I might choose to have that, but typically I won't eat before or during, and then I'll just have a high quality protein meal afterwards, for the normal benefits that we all ascribe, muscle protein synthesis and regeneration of muscle fibers that have broken down during the exercise. So I'll have a high quality protein based meal, and a typical meal for me, like I said earlier, focused on nutrient density, eggs, dairy. That's where I focus all of my effort. I throw a bit of leafy greens in for interest's sake, some nuts and seeds, makes things more interesting, more crunch, more texture, that kind of stuff. But really, you know, I get my nutrition from meat, fish, eggs, and dairy.
Jon, you mentioned you don't eat. Obviously, you're not fueling yourself during the ride. And if you are running a bit high or too high or higher than, you know, what you'd like to see, then you might take a correction bolus.
Yeah.
How do you deal with a low? So if you're dropping too low, would you take glucose tab?
That generally wouldn't happen. I would say almost never. Now, we can talk about extended fasting, and that's a bit different and more specialized. But on a normal ride, what I would normally do, let's say if it was a bit longer ride, I'm going to go out for 4 or 5 hours now, and it's going to be a sustained hard effort endurance ride. What I would normally do there is don't bother with my basal dose that morning. It's a super long and super hard effort that was going to go 8 or 9 hours or something. I might even ditch the basal dose the night before as well. So I'm now running with no basal whatsoever that day. But the exercise is just going to hoover up any glucose from gluconeogenesis. And that stress effect of the exercise driving the glucose into the blood, it's going to get cleared using non-insulin dependent glucose clearance pathways that we talk about. And then any insulin that is floating around, residual amounts of insulin, my insulin sensitivity is going to go up from that exercise, and it's going to hoover up the glucose nicely. So yeah, I would quit basal on the morning if it was a longer ride, maybe 4 or 5 hours. Quit basal for the morning and the night before if it was an even longer and even harder ride. But generally, I will never go too low, observing principles. I mean, if I do always carry dextrose tablets, and I would be able to rescue that with 1 or 2 dextrose tablets. The problems I only ever really experienced around exercise is afterwards. Let's say I've been trending upwards, I've put a couple of units of insulin in to cope with that rising trend. At the end of the exercise, might be a 3-hour ride or something. After the exercise, I might start to go a bit too low, and in that case, I might have to use a dextrose tablet. But usually, I'm eating within half an hour after an exercise bout anyway, just because it's a good idea to get the good quality protein in to feed those muscle cells what they require to rebuild and regrow. So lows, really not an issue. However, back in the day, as a poorly controlled type 1 diabetic, having those bars, those gels, all that crap, I had frequent hypos, and I would always have, you know, tons of jelly babies and stuff to stuff in my mouth to correct those hypos. You know, I was riding that, what some people call the carbo coaster, and it was terrible. But I don't get that. I just get, you know, usually very steady, you know, rock solid blood glucose values throughout a day. There's a bit of exercise. We've talked about some of that complexity, but usually, again, fairly solid. And I'm fueling my body on fat. I'm in ketosis the whole time, you know, except for obviously straight after a meal. But yeah, I'm running with high amounts of ketones, free fatty acids fueling my exercise. And it just works, and it's just so easy. And I look back on that difficulty that I used to live with as a type 1, and even before that as a not type 1, you know, suffering the bonk, people call it, on the bicycle, or hitting the wall, people call it if you're running. It was a constant fear and a dread of that. And now it couldn't be further from my mind, the idea of running out of energy. I could do a 1 month run from today, and I know I wouldn't run out of energy. It's just incredible to think that, you know, I used to live in fear of that, and now there's no fear whatsoever.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating that when I sit down and talk to other type 1s, and we're all doing we're all aiming at, lowering our A1C, and we've all eliminated the starches and the sugars, etc. But everything else could be very different. I haven't found someone actually who does exactly what I do to manage my own type 1 diabetes. This is why what you do with respects to diabetes education, empowering people, diabetics, because we're the ones living with the disease, and we're the ones living with it actually every single day, and no 2 days are alike. And so we have to learn how to manage this ourselves. So it's very interesting that you're saying, I mean, on a bike ride, anything more than an hour and a half, I will start dropping. So this is why I suspend my pump. So that's another feature on the pump I like. There are a few things I don't like about it, but I like the feature of suspending the insulin. So rather than having taken my basal, in advance, obviously, I just suspend the pump for 2 hours and that sorts it out. So I drop low when I'm riding a bike, or even a long walk, right? Longer walk, 9-mile walk is the longest from where we live to the supermarket, and there and back. I will inevitably drop, just without a doubt. I will drop every single time. So I suspend my pump sometimes just for half an hour, and that sorts it out. So it's interesting how differently we go about it, but we're all achieving the same thing. We're achieving normal blood sugars most of the time, and normal A1Cs, and we all want to avoid complications, diabetes complications. You said something earlier on about, when diabetes consultants or our healthcare clinicians say, well, eat whatever you want and cover it with insulin. And I heard from Dr. Ian Lake, that there are type 1s out there, minority, who seem to be doing an okay job with that, eating carbs and covering it with insulin. My question would be, though, where is all that sugar glucose going? Unless someone is massively active and burning all of it, where is all that sugar going? That's my first question. And the second is, isn't that sort of hyperinsulinemic state, because they're of course taking huge amounts of insulin to manage their carb intake, isn't that going to cause problems in the long run? Because now we know that hyperinsulinemia, regardless of your glycemic level, right? Hyperinsulinemia in itself could be a root cause of many diseases. So what are your thoughts on these?
Absolutely. So my mission is to control glucose to a normal level using the minimum amount of insulin. And I've involved myself in sort of thought studies and self-research studies to try and, help achieve that. And I need to get back into that. I've sort of put a pause on it because, there's only so much you can do before the wheels start falling off at home, for instance. We've got small children. I have a wife. I've got friends and family and hobbies and work, obviously. So it all adds up. And so I would like to get back into it, but I absolutely subscribe to the normal glucose for the lowest amount of insulin as the guiding principle in type 1 diabetes, which for me inevitably takes you into a real food, very low carbohydrate lifestyle. Maybe you can achieve it through not doing that, but I'm totally unconvinced. So what we know is that when we're injecting insulin peripherally into our tissues, it's not being secreted in the pancreas, so it cannot hold back glucagon. So glucagon is like a runaway train, and glucagon is being pumped out, telling your liver to make new glucose, gluconeogenesis. And that's happening all the time. And we can't hold that process back with exogenous or peripherally injected insulin. We're never going to raise the pancreatic insulin concentration to hold back that counter-regulatory hormone, glucagon. So that being the case, we are going to be running with peripheral insulin concentrations very much higher than a normal healthy person with a functioning pancreas. And therefore, you don't want to add fuel to the fire by having a high carb diet, which requires higher amounts of insulin and more peripheral insulin concentration, driving more hyperinsulinemia in the type 1 diabetic state. You just do not want that to happen. And then you look at, the hazard ratios for nephropathy or losing your kidneys, basically, and then losing your eyesight, losing your extremities in extreme circumstances where people have amputations with poorly controlled diabetes. You look at the hazard ratios of average blood glucose versus the hazard of those things, X, Y, Z. And for me, what I did, I reduced my HbA1c as a poorly controlled diabetic from about 43, 44, I think, millimoles per mole, down to 33 or 32 millimoles per mole. And that hazard reduction was about 5 times the hazard for losing my eyes or losing my kidneys, down to 2 times. And so even at that really well-controlled level of 32 millimoles per mole, which, my community diabetes service, they never see. In their whole year, they might see me and no one else or one other person that achieves that level of control. So I'm doing so much better, but still at that level, my hazard of losing my eyes or losing my kidneys is still twice the level of a healthy person with a functioning pancreas. So why on earth would I want to put stuff in my body that was going to drive me to inject more insulin and drive more hyperinsulinemia, run higher blood sugars as a result, and go back to those high hazard ratios? It makes no sense.
Yeah, well, I'm glad we share the same sort of opinion on that. But you did mention fasting earlier on. Let's talk about fasting, both intermittent and extended, and then finish this session off with your involvement with the 0105-100 project. Which I've talked about on numerous occasions on this channel, but it's good to remind the public what lessons were learned from that project. And you, Jon, were one of the participants. So let's start off with intermittent fasting. I currently only have 1 meal a day. I've made it work for me. And so I have no intention of changing that. It doesn't mean there are no days when I might just join the family for a small snack in the evening or something. But mostly my main meal of the day is at 1 p.m. or between 1 and 2, because then I'm having all my protein in one meal. So that's a huge amount of protein. And I do reach my daily requirement. And people are amazed, how did you eat that? Well, I took my time and, I didn't just gulp it down in 5 minutes. I took my time, I ate slowly, and I enjoyed it. And that's it. I've closed my kitchen for the next 23 hours. But that's a lot of protein to cover with rapid. And so I want to give myself those 4 to 6 hours post-meal to monitor and scan myself regularly. Fortunately, I work from home, and that allows me that time and the luxury to closely monitor my blood sugars. Now, you're having 2 meals, which actually means you're also doing intermittent fasting of at least 18 hours every day. How do you manage your basal? You have to reduce your basal insulin when you started intermittent fasting.
So when I went to a real food diet that was naturally lower in carbohydrates, I cut my basal in half. So it revealed to me that I wasn't quite clear on why I was using the basal that I was using, and I didn't really know what I was using that basal for. And I think what I believe is that a lot of the basal that's being used is likely covering for the stress effect of, you know, perhaps chronic inflammation, things leaking through the gut and driving inflammation in the body. Other stress effects, it might be a stressful lifestyle, it might be poor sleep. It's driving more gluconeogenesis through, you know, the runaway train of glucagon. I'd like to do some experimentation and some testing around that to sort of really develop those ideas. I don't believe anybody else is going to do it for me, and I doubt there's very much research out there that allows us to unpick this, because most research is targeted at finding a pharmaceutical that can be sold. Whereas I'm for making dietary changes, doing intermittent fasting, things to naturally reduce reliance on injected insulin in the type 1 state. But what I do is split my basal, and I only started splitting that after I changed to a real food diet that was twice a day, intermittent fasting, you know, like you say, 16, 18, 20 hours of not eating every day. So I find that basal regime works very well with intermittent fasting. If I was going to go into a longer fast, I might then just not do one of my basal doses. So if I knew I wasn't going to eat at all the next day, I might just cut my basal dose that morning, and then you know, maybe that night as well, depending on how my blood sugars were behaving, and then, you know, resume my basal after 1 or 2 basal doses were missed. So intermittent fasting every day for me, and like you, I do join in with a family breakfast or something from time to time, but it's not frequent. And that works really well for me in terms of just getting out of the habit of eating regularly. I certainly used to eat between every meal. So I used to have not only 3 meals, but 3 snacks a day. So 6 meals a day for all intents and purposes. So I find it helps me to control that just drive to eat and overeating frequency. What I do notice is that if I slip my lunch a bit, so I might normally have my lunch at about 1, but if I had a meeting 1 till 2, I might, you know, try to have my lunch at 2:15 or something, maybe even 2:30. And by that time, I've lost the drive to eat. And if I do end up eating, then I'm not ready for my dinner. And so I might just choose to, like you, just go OMAD for the day, one meal a day, and just have a larger meal as a consequence. So I find that intermittent fasting helps me to control the frequency of my eating. I know that intermittent fasting helps to keep insulin lower for longer. We know exactly how much insulin we're using because we're type 1s. Other people don't get that insight because they're not injecting the stuff. So I think from that perspective, type 1 is a blessing.
I've said that over and over again. You're just repeating the same words, really. I mean, we shouldn't be grateful for any disease. But if we're going to have one, then I mean, I'd rather type 1. That can be managed, and it does have its, you know, it does give you a good insight of exactly how much insulin you're relying on.
Yeah. You know, one of the companies I've started to partner with, I was joined it as a research, you know, in its research phase. They're now trying to commercialize it. It's Metabolic, and you might have met either Eric Smith or Gabor Adosi.
Gabor Adosi, I've interviewed him, and I'll put his video link below as well. And we did talk about Metabolic, which was at its very, very initial stages. Now you're collaborating with Metabolic. So what are you trying to put out there? I think it was the insulin testing genes.
So in the general population, you know, what their equipment can do is help to find hyperinsulinemia out in the wild, so to speak. So people that don't know they're hyperinsulinemic, they may be fasting they're passing a fasting glucose test. They might even be fasting an oral glucose tolerance test, but with hyperinsulinemia. So that's the general usage of that equipment. So it's point of care. So people can own the equipment themselves and use it, or they can go to what's called a craft clinic, and one of the practitioners measure their insulin for them and do a Kraft curve. For me, I was interested to know, is my body still making insulin? And ultimately, I'd like to know, can I increase that insulin secretion capability? I'm not for any moment believing that I can cure my diabetes, I can become normal overnight, but I'm interested in the notion that I might be able to regrow some insulin production capability. I just don't believe that that's been studied very enough. And certainly, when you look at 80-year-olds who've been living with diabetes for 60 years, a lot of them have still got some functional beta cell mass in there. So why? Is it that their rate of beta cell destruction just happens to be faster than the rate of creation? That's the issue. So stop the destruction and maybe you can create some. You probably can't cure yourself of diabetes, but maybe you can just secrete a bit more. So I was interested to know, am I still making some insulin? And I gave myself an oral glucose tolerance test after having gotten rid of my basal for enough time that I knew that there was none hanging around. So I wasn't going to be measuring the insulin I'd injected because that had cleared. Zero insulin, and then I had the 75 grams of glucose, and I measured some insulin, and it was a small amount of insulin, but it was there, and it came up as a spike and then tailed off. It showed me that I was still making some insulin, so perhaps there's something to work with there, and perhaps not. But I'll never know if I don't do the testing. So that's why I got the equipment, but I'm also then able to test other people and provide them with some information that they can take hold of their hyperinsulinemia if that's indeed what they've got. But fascinating equipment, fascinating organization to work with, and really beneficial for people that don't realize they could benefit from it. So it's how to get the word out. I think there's a huge opportunity to commercialize that. But we were talking about fasting, so let's come back to that and just finish.
Fasting. Have you done it before? The longest I've done was 100 hours.
Yeah, so I've got up to 100 hours as well. And I did that in preparation for the 0-5-100, and then the execution of the 0-5-100 project, which, as you've interviewed Ian, if people have seen that episode, was 5 days of not eating but running 100 miles, and all we had was water, a bit of black coffee to get us through. But we started it deep into ketosis. So we had reduced carbohydrates to ketogenic levels, typically less than 50 grams for most people, for long enough that we were able to just move into that 5 days of non-eating phase, already in ketosis, already accessing fat for fuel. And we just fueled all of that activity using stored fat. And we felt great. We all were running lower blood sugars with no hypos.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jon, but let's just tell the audience there were 8 participants in that project, and only 2 of you were type 1 diabetics. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So the end results of that project, when you compare the results or all the measurements, because you were being measured and checked along the way. So if you look at the analysis, there wasn't any difference between type 1s and non-diabetics.
Yeah. We all cognitively, we all felt great concentration, happiness, we all felt great. Hunger, we all felt the same. Blood glucose, we all were running low, stable blood glucose levels, and typically around about 3 millimoles, a bit below 3, 2.7, 2.8, those kind of values, which most people would see that's a hypo. But I would say, what is the context of that blood glucose? And if the context is you've achieved a deep state of ketosis, your brain has flipped its metabolic switch from burning more glucose to burning more fat. And when it's burning fat, it's happy. It's a steady delivery of fuel to those brain cells, which are happy. So the central nervous system doesn't detect a lack of, it knows it's got oodles of fuel deposited around this body in its adipocytes, which it breaks down into free fatty acids and ketone bodies, and those are fueling the muscles and fueling the brain just very happily. So there's no need to trigger a hypo. The hypo is triggered by the central nervous system detecting a lack of fuel. Fuel is there, it's being utilized, there is no hypo. So yeah, blood glucose thresholds for hypo is completely contextual, but most people don't understand it because they've never worked with somebody that's achieved a deeper level of nutritional or even therapeutic ketosis.
You know, that's very interesting. That's one of the topics about type 1 diabetes that I'm absolutely fascinated by, because how do you define hypoglycemia? I mean, I used to feel hypoglycemic at 6. I mean, at 6, because I would be dropping, crashing after that pizza. I would be crashing from 16 to 6, and then I would start shaking and feeling hypoglycemic at 6. Now I don't feel hypoglycemic at 3.6, for example. So the context is very, very important. And is it then dangerous being, you know, being steady? I'm not talking about constantly dropping, but you know, running steady all day long at 3.8, for example, being in full sort of full functioning mode, is it dangerous? Should we be concerned about that? I've wondered about that over and over again, because my diabetes consultant, for example, you know, the Libre registers the 3.9 as a hypo. Yeah. So he looks and he says, "You're having too many hypos." But I tell him, "Look, my hypo, like I'm at 3.9 all day long." And he says, "Oh, that like 8 hours you've been at 3.9." I said, yes, so I certainly wasn't hypoglycemic for 8 hours. I was just steady at 3.9. How do you explain
so
that?
if all right, so if you were concerned about your safety driving through a tunnel, would you go and consult somebody who's a bridge designer and has designed 4,000 bridges and all of those bridges work perfectly? Would you talk to that person? Or would you talk to somebody who's dug quite a few tunnels in his life? And that's the person I would talk to. So I don't seek out conversations with clinicians who've never worked with somebody who's fueled their body on fat and is running perfect levels in their blood fats, great triglycerides, great HDL, you know, who's maybe got a CAC score of 0, you know, their body fat, very, you know, just perfect. You know, everything's looking perfect in that person who happens to have, you know, a very sharp focus on nutrient density. Okay, so take a clinician who's worked with a lot of those people and ask that person the question, okay, do you have any insight on what is a normal blood sugar level and what is a hypo? I'm going to listen to that person, but I'm not going to listen to the bridge designer.
What a wonderful way to finish off this episode. I know you have a meeting coming up, Jon, but I could definitely talk to you for another hour. So maybe we'll do part 2 with Gabor Erdozi as well. Gabor Erdozi with us. So
that would be great.
So much, yeah, wouldn't it? Or even Dr. Lake in Lake. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm glad we made it. We've been trying to arrange this for a while. I'm sure the audience will find our conversation helpful or to benefit. So thank you so much, Jon.
Okay, thank you, Nayiri.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.